introduce the two wonderful speakers we have lined up for today. But before I do, let me take an opportunity to kind of contextualize the conversation. As you may know, my name is Sujith Xavier, and this panel will focus on transitional justice. And when Laura and the editorial collective, when we were thinking about kind of putting together the program, one of the really important things for us was to think through some of the themes. And in that sense, thinking through the themes of, or the theme of transitional justice meant that we had to think broadly, given the scope, the expansive scope of the field. And so on Monday, or was it Monday? It seems like it's been forever. On Monday, we heard from Julieta Lamet and Professor Kamari Clark. And in that sense, they spoke to us about the realities, the on-the-ground realities of transitional justice. So, you know, if I was to kind of deliver a kind of a 5-minute spiel on transitional justice, I would say it's a dynamic field that is filled with contestations, that has been animated by a liberal ethos, and in particular, the field has tried to navigate the challenges of dealing with past violence. How do we? The central question that the field tries to deal with is how do we move on from past violence? And so in that sense, what we heard from Julieta and Kamari was the on-the-ground reality. So for Julieta, she was speaking about being a judge in the transitional justice process unfolding in Colombia at the moment, and what she has to do to deal with the violence that's before her, or the violence that the perpetrators may have inflicted on the victims who are standing in front of her. And in that sense, or in that conversation, Kamari wonderfully kind of troubled a lot of those perspectives and those the vision that Julieta laid out in terms of, well, is it really important to name? What is the role of silence in all of this? And is silence really productive, or is it not? And for me, as someone who's been thinking about transitional justice for my entire life, given my own lived experience, that conversation was really, really useful in that you had a practitioner who used to be an academic and someone who was thinking carefully about how she was engaging and the performances that she was engaging in, to be then challenged and interrogated, but in the most kindest way possible by Kamari, right? And Kamari is one of the most kindest people I know so far, or thus far. And so her interventions seemed really, really enlightening. And for us, as part of the collective, we wanted to also kind of shift focus within the transitional justice conversation and shift to thinking, or we wanted to shift our thinking to, well, what is the role of the Constitution as we move forward, right? Once we have established the transitional justice mechanisms and processes, and we have, quote unquote, delivered justice in the most liberal sense, how can the contemporary liberal frameworks that we have help us move forward? And what does that look like? And today, we're really, really lucky to have these really awesome women with us who are going to take us through that. And so in terms of an introduction, let me begin with Amaya, and then I'll get to Natalia. Amaya, I miss you very much. I enjoyed, I think we all miss you very much, and we're really sad that you're not able to be here, but we understand. And so Professor Amaya Alvez is a professor at the University of Concepcion, and she's been thinking about the role of the Constitution in a transitional justice context for a very long time. And in that sense, she's been thinking about the realities of the Pinochet Constitution in Chile and its impacts. And in that sense, she was elected to the Constitution Convention that started a few years ago, and she was She was helping draft the Constitution. And so, Amaya, I'm really, really glad you're able to be here. And this takes us back to the conversation that you and I started when we sat in a classroom in 2008 and when we were fighting over who was going to present David Trubeck and Mark Galanter's paper to our PhD class. And so I'm really, really delighted that we can hear from these two powerful women today as we close as we have our final session. So Amaya, I think I'm going to pass the floor on to you, but before I do, I just want to kind of take a moment to identify, some of the issues that you will be dealing with, and I'll quickly. So Amaya, I think when we began our conversation about this panel, we had thought that it would be interesting if you could share with us some of the challenges of drafting the Chilean constitution that was meant to bring Chile out of the Pinochet regime's lingering legacies, I suppose. And in that sense, I think, for us, if we were to situate this within the literature of transitional justice, constitutional reform is often presented as the way we can move forward. And constitutional reform is what we have in Nepal, in Afghanistan, et cetera, as a way to move on from violence. And I think your story and the story of the Chilean Constitution tells us something about that process. And in the same vein, I think in the Colombian context, Colombia is often celebrated as the darling of the West in terms of having a successful constitution. Okay, Amaya, over to you. And I thought it might be really productive to start with maybe some of the challenges and then shift to the more enthusiastic or the more kind of positive way of thinking about these questions.
Okay, thank you so much. Can you hear me well? Yes? Okay, great. Thanks, Sujith, and hello to everyone. I really miss you too. I'm sorry I can't be there in person, but I think you're in the best company. It sounds very weird. Justice Angel, for me, is Natalia Angel, someone that I'm really proud to call my friend, but I'm really proud of her work and her contribution. So I think you're in the best company. I see many of my dear friends from TWAILR, and I really hope those of you who are for the very first time there, you will make good friends. Having good company in this path is really relevant. So I really hope you make good friends. You are in very good company to pursue some of the challenges you will be addressing today and the previous day too. I have a powerful presentation, so this is when everything goes wrong, but I will share my screen. I hope it works. Does it? Yeah. Can you see my screen now?
Sí, te vemos.
Okay, great. Okay, so I have some reflections on, I was thinking about transitional justice that I'm really unable to address all the topics, so I thought I might grasp some of them. And I will kind of focus my few reflections on Indigenous people. I've been working for a long time now, around 15 years, on Indigenous people, representation and inclusion. And I think the previous constituent process in Chile, the 2021 and 2022 process, was really relevant of this. I'm not exactly sure how many of you have a lot of context of this, but I'll be very brief, but I wanted to give you some framework. So Chile had in the past 12 constitutions. So it's a lot of constitutions. So we might think, why do we have so many constitutions in Latin America? I think this is a very interesting question that I won't be able to address now, but it's maybe something we should think. I mean, is there something special about constitution in the way we think of them, the role they have? And the 22 process was actually quite different. Why? Because it started with a social movement that was increasing over time. Our last constitution, the 1980 constitution, was imposed by the dictatorship, the Pinochet dictatorship. So it is a constitution that was never debated within the Chilean society. It's a constitution that set up a very, very extractivist and capitalist economic system that pervades everything. So almost every, I would say, social right was transformed into a commodity. Water is a commodity. I mean, the market system was kind of expanded into almost everything: education, health, water. And this has had over time a lot of consequences. Why? Because it made the gap between people huge in terms of you have a system of rights that will protect you as long as you have a certain income. If you have money, you will be super well off. If you're not, actually, you won't have education, health, like basic goods. And the other thing I think we haven't been able to debate enough in Chile is that it really collapsed the gap between public law market type system and public law or public goods, or even constitutional values. I mean, everything became private in the sense that the private sector will be in charge of almost everything. And so there's this process started in 2019. I just give you some references. Professor Luis Eslava has been worked for a long time in Chile throughout this process, and he has some videos that I thought are really relevant, so I'll give you the reference. But the thing is, the movement start to kind of build up based on different interests, like gender movement, feminists, a lot of environmental critiques because of the extractivist system, the water rights advocate, the social movements that wanted to have more direct representation in decision-making processes, all the people that were deceived by the social security model, and of course, indigenous people that have never been recognized in any previous constitution. So one of the problems of the constitutional system that were built in Chile is that it left out different groups of the population. Specifically, indigenous people have never been recognized as such. So collective rights of indigenous people have been never recognized or even treated in the constitution as like a special community, or the treaties that have been celebrated between the state and the indigenous communities were never recognized in any of those 12 constitutions. The political system was very, very slow to respond to these challenges by different social movements, by different groups of the population. Maybe the highest kind of political response was throughout Michelle Bachelet, the first female president of Chile, set up a participatory constituent process in 2016. It was a top-down process. It started with the president and the National Congress, and it had a lot of participation, but finally it didn't work out. It didn't move forward in the National Congress. There were a lot of political forces that didn't want that change. So what we had in 2019 was a huge social unrest. Like, people were on the streets for 3 months. And sometimes we say this, we have been seeing this movement in France, we have seen in Sri Lanka a couple of years back, but at least I am already 52 years old. I've never seen this in Chile. We were on the street for almost 3 months. Like, people were really, they stopped working, like everything shut down in terms of like markets. People start going to university. I mean, really, the country stopped. And in the middle, in the soul of this moment was a demand for a new constitution. That was part, kind of the central aim was this idea that a new constitution could set up a different political agreement, a different system of interacting to each other. And maybe this is the most well-known picture of that time, that social unrest in 2019. And this is a particular site that in Chile, a square that was called the Dignity Square. In this square, what you see are different flags, but the flag that is on top of the last person standing on top of that monument is the indigenous people's flag. So at the core also of the estallido social, of this demand for change, for the new constitution, was this idea that indigenous people have never been recognized and that should have a role to play in our new political agreement, our new constitutional agreement. So I will start briefly, of course, to address how the Constitutional Convention in 2021 up until July 22 was able to address this void in constitutional norms about indigenous people. And this is the very first day of the convention. And it was a remarkable day because the president of the convention, the elected president of the convention, we vote, I was part of the convention, and we vote that day to elect the president of the convention, and we elected Elisa Loncon. And Elisa Loncon was a Mapuche representative. We had 17 seats for indigenous people, and she's a doctor, a linguistic professor, and her native tongue is, her native language is Mapuzungun, which is the Mapuche's people language. And she will give her first talk, her first kind of, so to say, starting talk in her own language. And that was already a big kind of a huge change for a country that has never given any space, public space, to indigenous people. So that was already a big change. And the representation of the convention, this is relevant, I think, for what happened after, is it was a lot of people that have never been part of a political party, a lot of members of social movements, of different groups, of territorial representation. And actually, we really tried to put this into action. Roberto Gargarella's demand of the Constitution as a law that permits, that allows to be a conversation among equals. So this idea of a system that responds to popular representation and organized spaces for mobilization rather than secluded council for experts actually was at the core of what we did for the very first day in 2021. Like looking backwards, I have been thinking that there were very many challenges that, of course, we didn't address properly. You know, I mean, you already know this didn't work, right? I don't want to see it as a failure. I will think it was an exercise and we learned from it, but of course, it has been seen as a big failure in Chile and that had a backlash. And I will talk about that very briefly. I think this idea of no political expertise was seen as a good thing because you represented more real demands of people on the street, but at the same time, in a country with very low democratic density, make it very difficult to debate, to dialogue, and to grasp some agreements. You know, there was a certain detachment of experts. Academics were not always welcome, and that needs to make us think the way we work, the way we research, the way we let others know our findings in terms of research. I do think that this representation of particular interests, so people were interested only in water, only in indigenous rights, only in kind of feminist provisions, that idea of being only there to kind of demand, protect, and include some particular provisions, make it very difficult to look for the whole picture, for the Constitution as a whole. I do think that the process was drafted in a way that made it very difficult to work out. Only 1 year, we didn't have even the provisions or the rules of procedure. We didn't know at the beginning how we will come up with agreements to build the new provisions for the new constitution. And I do think there was a high expectation that we will be able to solve the political demands that were represented on the streets through a legal norm. And I think that's maybe too much to expect from the law, the way we know it, like liberal constitutionalism. And another, I think, challenge was that there was a full transparency all the time, like all the meetings were all the time broadcasted. I mean, broadcasted on television, on YouTube. So every disagreement was kind of cut and shown as a problematic. And of course, those who were not in agreement with the new provisions, with the new constitution, used it to show it as a show politics, as though the people were debating, they were using like strong words to call the other, and that was used all the time on the news to kind of show this process as a flawed process, as a kind of failure in a way. So, okay, the constitution draft, the question is if responded or not to the demands of that constitutional moment in Chile, to all the demands made by social forces. And I do think our proposal, our draft, was in line with the new constitutional Latin American constitutionalism, and it aimed to be transformative constitutionalism. I mean, provisions were very, very different from what we had in the past. It meant to take into account the challenges of the 21st century for Chile, the challenges of climate change, the challenges of inclusion, and it was massively rejected in September 2022. And then I, of course, have many questions. I don't have all the answers, but I can share with you some of the debates that have been occurring in my country afterwards. So Arnold Becker, in an interview, in a very recent interview that has not been yet published, said that, of course, there was different interpretations depending for where this come from. So from the left, there was a lot of critiques because of disinformation and dark campaigns based on, for example, social media, the way in which the algorithm of social media work to show specific provisions with specific interpretation. That was very relevant. The right-wing criticism was to take specific provisions of the new constitution and give a very radical interpretation. So it was kind of interesting. People were saying the very same who gives these very radical interpretations, if this constitution works, I mean, it's approved in September, will be the first one to defend the most conservative interpretation of the very same clause. So that's one example of how interpretations are really relevant. The center was talking all the time of the lack of experts, the lack of academics, the technical deficiencies of the text. And the right were very afraid of all new institutions, plurinationality, inclusion of indigenous people, legal pluralism. I mean, there was everything that kind of goes the way of the mainstream, of the way in which the elites have been in charge of every single legal construction was seen as something fearful, something we should be afraid of. And there are many hypotheses for this reaction, but I want to argue two things. I just want to focus on two things. One thing, I will argue that reaction to indigenous people demands in the 2022 draft were at the center of the reaction. I do think that the inclusion of indigenous people and indigenous people's right for the very first time in Chilean history was at the center of one of the reasons why people rejected massively. I mean, only 38% of those who voted in favor of the new draft, and 62%, more or less, voted against. So this is huge if we compare that 80% of Chileans voted in favor of having a new constitution. I mean, the data is not exactly the same because the first vote was not mandatory, and the vote for the approval or rejection of the draft was mandatory, which is one of the promise of the design of the process, right? And I mean, if we see this as a big reason, I do think there was an anti-indigenous move. We could even call it a racist backlash. I think, I mean, Arnold has been calling that. I was more afraid of using that big words, but I do think we could call it now, as we see what is happening right now in Chile, as an anti-indigenous racist backlash. So I do think that this is a critique of the very same group I'm part of, but I think constitutional scholars play a role in describing the 2022 draft as flawed, dangerous, or misaligned with Chilean constitutional tradition. I think that was one of the reasons why people were so afraid, because the experts, those who are supposed to know better, were saying, no, We are using here words we've never used before. We are giving space to groups that we've never recognized before. And this is exactly one of the reasons I do think the draft was so good, because for the very first time, make it visible so many groups that have been kept invisible and kind of address this violence of invisibility. So the main targets of critique were plurinationality, prior and informed consent for indigenous people, the idea of decentralization of taxes and territories, the idea of creating indigenous territorial autonomy and linguistic rights for indigenous people. And I think one of the problems were to see the other, to get to know the other, and to give power to the other. Isabella Mamani was one Aymara representative. She used to come to the sessions dressed in her traditional clothing like this one. And she's a lawyer. I think her work was really relevant. Her work was really good. And people would not accept that she would make legal claims because of who she was. And I found it so revealing. This idea of resist the power of prejudice and ignorance, and appreciate how relative our own knowledge is, to understand how much knowledge is there outside there, even if I don't know it, and if I've never seen it. And this idea of being open to this knowing knowledge, which is not something we saw on an everyday basis. So I will just describe 3 ways in which indigenous people were able to create norms for the draft. There was a reserved indigenous seats, and this has been claimed by Tiare Aguilera, the Rapa Nui representative, and one of Luis Eslava's video that I really hope you will all watch and see. And she was saying for the very first time, they are not talking about us. They're not talking about there. We are using the very first pronoun, I. And I am talking about my own indigenous beliefs, worldview. I am creating the norms. And there was also a prior consultation throughout the process itself. And there was the option of popular indigenous initiative of constitutional norms. The indigenous seats were 17. So most indigenous people in Chile are Mapuche. And there was also a specific thematic commission on indigenous people rights with I think it was around 24 members. I was one of the members of that commission. They were dealing with all the indigenous norms of all the draft. And there was a lot of negotiation. It was relevant to debate among us, because normally we use that word like all indigenous people, but not everyone was exactly the same. There were many differences among them. There was a prior consultation. It was a small one because it was throughout the process, but it was interesting. And there was a lot of indigenous initiative of constitutional norms, 272 indigenous initiatives. And of course, there was a lot of conversations going on between these organizations and the people who were part of the convention. This is the picture of the convention itself. I do think part of the provisions are very transformative in the sense that it address all problems with new solutions. And I just brought 3 examples. One, in terms of climate change and ecological crisis, there was this idea of a section 127 that says that nature has rights, and that the state must adopt an ecologically responsibly administration and promote environmental scientific education through permanent training and learning processes. I do think that this idea of an ecocentric constitution and kind of shifting for an anthropocentric paradigm, it's a very challenging one. I'm not saying it's not. I'm just saying it's a relevant one, it's a necessary one, and it's one that Latin America has a lot to say. I mean, for once, we are ahead in the game in this constitutional provision. So I do think it was a relevant one. In terms of women, I do think this was a feminist constitution, and it says that we need to build, for example, a democracy that is paritarian, that gives women, but it's not a binary, it's not male or women, it's it's women, and it's all like diversity, we should at least give it a parity composition, so at least 50%. And I do think this could change the face of democracy if we really gave women at least half of their representation of the role of the duties. And finally, for Indigenous people, Section 102 says that Indigenous people should, and Indigenous people lands should enjoy special protection, and that we should pursue a constitutional process that will cadaster, regularize, demarcate, title, reparate, and restitute Indigenous land. This is a huge problem in Chile that almost leads us to a civil war in southern Chile in terms of land claims of Indigenous people against some forest companies and some kind of main agricultures. So I already addressed this. Sujith, don't get nervous. I only have 3 more slides to go. And I want to say thank you to one of our students in the class we just gave about constitutionalism of the global south, because Maria Jose, one of her comments like allude to this piece is the Constitution, the Trap, by Ricardo Sanín and Marianela Machado. And I read it and I thought it was so interesting, because I used to use this this picture of one of the protests when it says new constitution or nothing. And I used to believe that it was this binary, new constitution or nothing. And I used to think after the 4th of September of last year that we end up with nothing. And somehow I go back now from an academic perspective, and sometimes I keep on thinking if maybe, and this paper helped me so much to think that way, if maybe the Constitution is the trap, it's maybe constitutional law who is not able to deliver the change. Maybe the very idea of constituent power on the way in which we're supposed to construct a new political agreement is just flawed. It's not possible, because outside these agreements, there were so many huge forces kind of working against it. And Arnold also asked if this critique of the Chilean process are global, if we can go broader than only Chile, because there was a certain fantasy about the change that could be provided through international law and through human rights, a sort of a legal fetishism, how much power there was in constitutional law for those who didn't want the change, or how much change it was possible through international law and human rights. Many times, international law was claimed in a very uncontroversial and authoritative force. And I do think, I mean, you're working on that through TWAILR, so I just want to put it on the table, man. You are very well equipped for this critique. And I'm just concerned if constitutional law is always connected to this idea of good statehood or civilized statehood, and how we could reclaim that idea, or if it's possible to reclaim it. And I do think in Latin America, human rights are understood to be progressive because they have been working against dictatorship for so long, especially the Inter-American human rights system. So I do think the Inter-American human rights system has a lot to provide and a lot of responses to give in what we're just dealing with. And this is the final one. I'm not sure if it's possible to rewrite the rules of the game. I'm not sure anymore if a constituent process is able to deliver what we're aiming for. And we need to also rethink the role of international law and human rights, not in a fetishist way, but really how in our context are able to deliver responses to the claims, and how we address diversity, this idea of we the people. In Chile, it became so different. It was almost impossible to really answer every claim, that this idea of identity politics became really difficult. I think we as experts and as academics should be much more humble in the way we interact with real citizens. I don't think we did a great job throughout the last process, and I don't think we're doing a great job throughout the actual process we're going through. And I really think Latin America is our kind of parameter. We should rethink all our comparative exercises among our fellow colleagues in Latin America. And this is it. Many thanks.